Hi, everybody. One of the most important things that I'm looking for in any piece of writing is how you integrate quotations, how you lead into quotations, and how you structure a sentence that integrates or incorporates some sort of source material that you're quoting. This is important not only when you're using quotations, but also when you're paraphrasing a source or putting it in your own words. It's still important to lead into it by explaining that it came from a certain source, that you're paraphrasing a certain source. This allows you to cite a source in a certain way. Now, we use MLA style for our documentation in English classes, and that means two things. Well, it means three things. One thing that it means is how you lay out the paper. I don't really much care about that. I don't really much care if you have a running head at the top with your last name and a page number, because that's really only important if I have physical papers and I had a stack of them and I was walking around and I tripped and they fell everywhere and some came out of the staples and I don't know whose is whose and I'm trying to put them back together. I need someone's last name at the top and what page it is. So that doesn't matter when you're turning it in online. Another thing that MLA says to do is have that header on that first page. You don't have a cover page in MLA, but they say to put your name and the name of the class and the professor's name and the date. I forget the order before you have a title centered. I don't really care about that either. Even if you don't put your name on your paper, you're going to be turning it in through Canvas as logged in as you, so I know it's your paper. Online teaching has kind of made that stuff a little bit less important. It could be good to know how to format it that way if you get a teacher who's a stickler about that formatting. The only thing I really care about for MLA formatting is that it is in 12-point font. Times New Roman is the best font, the font that I would like you to use. But even that is less important than 12-point font, double spaced. 12-point Times New Roman font and double spaced, right? And then 1-inch margins on all sides. That's standard. That's really the only thing in formatting that's a big deal to me. You should have a kind of a creative title at the beginning of your papers. That means don't name your paper personal essay. So for example, essay number 1 is a personal essay. That's the name of the assignment. It's not the name of your essay. Come up with a creative, what is your personal essay about? Well, it's about relating your experience to these ideas, like this idea of grit or having a fixed or growth mindset, right? But experiencing the fear of a student. So come up with something, right? Don't just, also don't call it essay number 1. That's not a good title. Shouldn't call it that. So have a title, 1-inch margins, double spaced, 12-point Times New Roman font. Other than that, MLA is really just about, having an MLA style paper is really just about source documentation, citation. 2 kinds of citation. In-text citations, that's after you paraphrase or quote something, it's the little things in parentheses at the end of the sentence before the period, right? Or the other thing, not or, because you have to have both. If you have a quotation or paraphrased material, either one, even if it's in your own words, if you're taking it from a source, you have the parenthetical citation. I'll talk about what goes in there at the end of the sentence. And then it also has a works cited page at the end. I'm not going to talk as much about the works cited page in Unit 1. We're going to get to that. But I am going to talk about your in-text citation and leading into your quotations, because a lot of what you should be doing is not in the citation. It's in your sentence before you get to the quote. Say something about the author, right? So I'm going to share a little a lesson plan that I put together, and I'll have the link too, so you could besides me having it on the screen here, you can also pull it up. Okay. So the link will be in the page, so you should be able to follow along with this. Ways to introduce, integrate, and integrate quotations. What I say here is when you quote another writer's words, or even when you just paraphrase them, it's always best to introduce or contextualize the quote. By contextualize, I mean, if there's, maybe you might need to say something about, not just about who the author is, but what they were talking about in their article. Summarize their article briefly before you say that they said this one thing. Or maybe you need to explain what they're talking about at the time when they say this one thing. It's always better to integrate it into your own sentence rather than just plop it down and think that it speaks for itself. There's something called quote sandwiching, where it's the quote is the meat in the filling in your sandwich, but you need the bread, right? Top and bottom. You need something before and after that quotation. It's almost always better it will almost always be better to familiarize your readers with the source author and the title, as well as any information they might need to understand the author's point. So this is what I'm talking about. And then don't forget to include the necessary info, be the author's last name, and then the page number. But here's the thing. You only need to put the author's last name in the parentheses if you did not mention the author's last name when you led into the quote. So that's a big thing that you can do when you're about to give a quote. If you mention the author, you say, according to so-and-so, I'm going to give you some strategies for introducing quotes. Then you don't need to put it, and you just need to put a page number in your citation. So I'll point out MLA format for for in-text citations too. So let's look at this. First, I talk about quote introduction. These are ways of leading in to a quote. So first, if you're just going to lead in or introduce a quote, a lot of times students have a quote just standing by itself as a sentence. No words leading into it. But they think, oh, well, the sentence before it led into it. So that's why I didn't put any words before the quotation, because the sentence that I wrote before, I wrote a sentence, ended it with a period, and then I thought that sentence kind of set up the quote that I put next. If that's the case, if you have a whole sentence, instead of putting a period at the end, if you think it leads into the quote, if you have a whole sentence, use a colon, right? The two dots, not a semicolon, a colon. So is an example here. In his analysis of policy regarding government regulation of social media, John Samples of the Cato Institute, right, I mentioned him, who he is, argues that not even national security threats are a sufficient excuse. Okay. This is a whole sentence setting up the quote for what John Samples says, right? So because it's a whole sentence, I use a colon there. That's important. Now, because I mentioned John Samples in this, then I only need the page number in my citation. Now look how my MLA citation is in parentheses after the quotation mark, but before the period. There's not a period here before the quotation mark and here. You don't need two periods. The period is removed from the end of the quote and just put after the citation there. And all I need there is the page number. I don't put the word page. That's a no-no. I don't put an abbreviation of the word page. I don't put like P or PG. No, I just put the number, 23. That means page 23. Now, if I didn't mention John Samples, and there's the only reason that you wouldn't mention the author's name before a quote is because you already mentioned them. So you can mention who John Samples is in first introducing a source that you're going to be quoting from, but then maybe a couple sentences after that, you want to quote from John Samples again, but you don't feel that you need to introduce him again because you already introduced him, in that case, you can do it like here. Government regulation of social media for the purposes of censorship could result in the very thing it's trying to prevent, colon, because I used a complete sentence before my quote, colon. Now I have my quote, and then I put, because I didn't mention his name, I put Samples 23. That means page 23. And then they're going to look, they're going to say, oh, John Samples said this. Or they're going to look at your citation, they'll say, oh, Samples. Then they'll be, if they want to look it up, they go to your works cited page. All of your works cited entries are alphabetized by the last name of the author. That's why it's important. You don't put the first and last name if it's in the in-text citation. You can in the sentence, like this, but in the in-text citation, it's just the last name. And that's because that's how it's alphabetized on your works cited page. Now, note, I say here, note that the first letter after the quotation marks should be uppercase, because if you have a complete sentence here and you set it up with a colon for a quotation, what follows has to be a complete thought. And you're treating it like a complete sentence. Even if you're only using part of a sentence, then you need to make sure that it's capitalized. Even if it wasn't capitalized in the original, you can alter the capitalization with brackets, which I mentioned here. If you take any words out of the middle of a quotation, you can use these ellipses, the 3 dots. So, what we have here is, to quote a researcher or authority, you can use an introductory phrase. According to John Samples from the Cato Institute, right? You can give more information, not just the last name. In Samples' words, right? So the first time you're introducing a source, give all that information. According to John Samples, in his article, in his article, so-and-so, such and such, according to John Samples, who works as a so-and-so for the Cato Institute, comma, and then you start a quote. So when you are leading into a quote with just a phrase like this, these are prepositional phrases. In his words, by his understanding, from his perspective, right? I'm using his name. I put a comma, and then the quote that follows such a phrase must be a complete thought. Now, this is a complete thought, but I took words out of the middle that I didn't think were necessary, so I put the ellipses. And it wasn't the first word of the sentence in the original article, so this word a was actually lowercase, but because I'm using it like it is a sentence, I have put brackets around the word a, and I've made it uppercase, because it should appear like a sentence here, even if I have to alter the capitalization. Okay, another way to introduce a critic's words is with a descriptive verb, right? Okay, so Samples states, or you could say, do the full introduction if you need to. John Samples from the Cato Institute, in his article such and such, states, comma, right? Remarks, comma. These are called signal verbs or reporting verbs. There are a ton of them. There are way more than these that I've written here. You try not to say the word says, the verb says, because you're usually quoting something they wrote and they didn't actually verbally say it. But this works the same way. States, comma, then this needs to be a complete thought, and it should be capitalized, even if you have to alter the capitalization. But it needs to be a complete thought. So if I got rid of the words do not stand up, I couldn't just quote this. Sample states the arguments what? You haven't made a complete thought. It needs to be a complete thought in those quotes. Okay, and then you're just putting the page number over here, right? Now, I mentioned here, you can't use the word quotes as a signal verb unless you're saying that he quoted someone else, because the verb quotes is not, you're quoting them. But if you say samples quotes, then you're saying samples is quoting someone else. And if that's the case, then you have what's called an indirect source. An indirect source is when you like a quotation in an article, but it's not the writer who used it. The writer was quoting someone else. There are a few ways to handle that. So I mentioned here how you can have a really in-depth introduction to the quote that explains that, John Samples, in his article, quotes legal scholar David Post, who describes wartime suppression of speech by the government as being, and then you have a quote, deeply misguided and shameful. Okay. Or then because you mentioned that it was Samples that was quoting David Post, then you have the last name of the person whose source is on your works cited page, and you just need the page number here. But if you don't do that and you just attribute it to the person who said it, you said legal scholar David Post describes wartime suppression of speech as deeply misguided, then you have to do this. Quote it in Samples, QTD period in Samples. So what you're saying is this quote appears in my article sample. You can find it on my works cited page under the Samples, the last name Samples. So you have to be clear about that. Now, so remember, if part of the quote is the words of the author and another part is the author's quotation, then you get into what's called nested quotations. So if you say Samples quotes legal scholar David Post, who argues that the history of suppressing speech during wartime has often later been judged to be, so these are actually, I started my quote, these are the words of John Samples in his article, and only here did he start quoting David Post. So what I've done is I've put single quotation marks inside. Do you see that? And then double quotation marks on the outside of the whole quote. That's called nested quotations. And that's what you do when you have quotes within quotes. Now, what I'm going to talk about next is integrating quotes, which I've given you an example of up here. If you see here, I did not quote in these sentences, I did not quote a complete thought, and I didn't capitalize the beginning of it like I was talking about above. That's because I've integrated those quotes. This is not just a little verb phrase or introductory phrase like these. By the way, something I forgot to mention, a lot of students like to say, according to Samples, he states, and try to do both of those things. Never do that. Choose one or the other. You either choose the reporting verb or you choose an introductory phrase, but don't try to shove both in the beginning of a sentence. But all of these up here, they need to be a complete thought and they need to be capitalized. But if you are just integrating a part of a quotation, then as long as it makes sense grammatically, you don't need to put a comma before the quote and it doesn't need to be capitalized. So let's move on to the next page. It talks about that. Quote integration, making it part of your own sentence structure. You can begin a sentence with your own words and then complete your sentence with the quoted words. It could be even a short phrase. Sometimes it's just a single word or a couple of words that you're integrating into your sentence. So Samples identifies two different kinds of speech that are, quote, not protected by the First Amendment. Okay. The colon is not part of the quote. I'm putting it there because I'm going to list the two kinds of speech. But these are the only words of Samples that I put in my sentence. I mentioned him still, right? So all I've got to do here is the page number. But here, not protected by the First Amendment is not a complete thought. It has become part of my thought. Two different kinds of speech that are not protected. It's one flowing thought. I'm not going to put a comma before this quote because it's integrated. Here, even some philosophical or abstract statements about whether it's necessary or morally acceptable to commit violence or criminal acts, quote, cannot be punished by the government unless there is reason to believe. So I've just quoted 6 words in the middle of my sentence, right? I don't need to capitalize the word cannot. I don't need to put a comma before it. It just becomes part of my sentence. Now, one thing I want you to watch out for is sometimes you use one of these reporting verbs like samples contends, samples emphasizes, samples describes, okay, but when you use the word that or as, suddenly it is integrated. So samples contends that. So if you had, instead of using the word that, if you had put a comma here, then you could have left this uppercase. Social media, it was uppercase, capitalized, because it was a sentence. I could have left it like a capitalized sentence and just put a comma here. But because I used the word that, I now put no comma before the quotation. And if this was capitalized, it now needs to be lowercase. Maybe a little complicated. Samples emphasizes that the case for more government power remains at best unproven. So again, instead of putting a comma, I used the word that, and now it's integrated. The word as does the same thing. Samples describes private moderation of speech on social media as more effective. Samples characterizes these social media giants as technically sophisticated and far more. So that should be a bullet point too. I need to fix that. So those are just some examples, but you see the rules change if you're integrating just part of a sentence into your own grammar, your own sentence structure. It's still important to introduce the source though, and you need to get those citations right? If you didn't mention the author's name in the sentence where you integrated the quote, then the last name needs to go in the citation. Now, just some errors, some common errors to watch out for is sometimes this leads to mixed construction when you are introducing a source. When you say in the article by, in the article such and such by so and so, then a lot of times students try to jump right to the verb, argues, states, that reporting verb. What happens is they create a mixed construction where there is no subject for the verb. So look at this incorrect one. In the article, Why the Government Should Not Regulate Content Moderation of Social Media, that's the title, by John Samples, argues. Now, students will do this. Say it's a simpler title, like in the article, The Government Should Not Regulate by John Samples, argues. The problem here is that the verb argues has no subject. This is a prepositional phrase. In the article, such and such, the word in is a prepositional phrase. It's a preposition, so this creates the prepositional phrase, in the article. The word by is a preposition. It's a type of word, preposition. If you know your parts of speech, it's pretty standard. The word by is a preposition, so it creates the prepositional phrase by John Samples. Something cannot be in a prepositional phrase and also the subject of a sentence because it's the object of the preposition. It can't also be the subject of the verb. So I can't be saying John Samples argues because it's part of this, by John Samples. You can't say by John Samples argues. You can't say the article argues because it's saying in the article. You can't say in the article argues. So there are a couple ways to fix this, which is why it's called a mixed construction. You can get rid of one of the prepositions. So for example, you could just delete the word by, put a comma over here after the title. In the article, Why the Government Shouldn't Regulate, comma, John Samples argues. Then it's the subject and the verb. John Samples argues that private companies should be. Okay, that's one way to fix it. Or, as I've fixed it down here, in the article, Government Shouldn't Regulate, by John Samples, he argues. And I've just added the subject for the verb. So that's something that comes up when you are introducing quotations. Now, the other thing, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen here. The other thing that I need you to keep in mind, every body paragraph in your paper, I'm expecting you to be sharing anecdotes, sharing personal experience, but along the way, you need to be relating that personal experience to your chosen concept or the concept from the reading, right? So that means you need to bring up the reading. And so I'm looking for you to introduce a quote or paraphrase something from the reading as you're relating it to your personal experience. So if you're telling me about how you achieved goals through grit by not giving up and seeing things through, right? And you have a couple of stories about not giving up on something and seeing them through, right? You tell me your story and then say, this is, you know, a time when I really demonstrated what Angela Duckworth talks about when she says, quote, and then you introduce a quote, right? But after the quote, you also need to talk about it. Quotes don't speak for themselves. So this is a time, you know, when this happened to me, I was really demonstrating what Angela Duckworth talks about in Grit when she says, quote, not giving up, or, you know, whatever the quote says. After the quote, end quotes, you know, citation, period. Then you say, talk about that, right? Duckworth is saying this. Maybe you can just put it into different words or unpack it a little bit and explain it, right? This was similar to my experience because, right, and explain it more. This is what's called analysis. And it's the other part of this quote sandwich. You lead into a quote, that's the top bun, is leading in and setting up that quote and giving us the context we know, telling us who you're quoting so we know. And then the bottom bun is you're going to talk about that quote. You're going to talk about why it's an interesting quote, or what it proves, what it shows, how it's relevant to what you're talking about at the time. If you do that, if you can figure out that and get good at that, then that's like half the battle of strong writing in an academic setting, is being able to, you know, incorporate source material to prove a point. That's what every body paragraph, that's what teachers are always looking for in your paragraphs in an essay in college, that you're able to do that. So have some work on that, and we'll be able to I'll be giving you feedback on this in your essays for sure, because that's one of the things that I give a lot of feedback on, is quote introduction leading into quotes, and then also MLA. And I'm going to be talking more about works cited page and how you cite it on the works cited page in another video for you. So hopefully this was helpful, and the link to this that lesson is on this page if you want to return to it later. Okay.